and also Chomsky on the purpose of education, kind of anarchist views of what alternatives might look like. It's not correct, however, to say that a crit reflects the relationship between client and architect, and that therefore crits prepare students to work with clients. Clients and architects are in fact equal parties to a business transaction. The architect can and often does walk out if they feel unfairly treated. A student has no such freedom. He or she must submit to the judgment of a crit if they wish to work as architects. In fact, the crit is an almost perfect example of the institutional exercise of symbolic violence, which I'll describe a little bit more below. First of all, students receive judgment of their work from people empowered by the state to regulate their admission into the profession. Students are therefore in an asymmetrical power relationship to critics. As if to guarantee this, the student is usually outnumbered by the critics. Secondly, if the student argues back, they're told, you're not here to defend your work, this is not a judgment, these are just opinions which you're free to accept or reject, you must learn not to take it personally, and so on. This is an example of what Bourdieu, who I'll come to in a second, calls misrecognition. Number three, the judgments are given in front of the students' peers, which may make the crit socially significant to them by associating social with professional success. The state-backed authority may be concealed behind rationality or the prestige or charisma of a particular critic. Finally, the main concealment of the use of force is structural, i.e., the fact that by virtue of being qualified architects, the critics' opinions have authority. So good architecture is what our qualified architects say it is, regardless of reasons given. Okay, my thesis is that the architectural school crit is a ritual at which the field of architecture attempts to secure its prerogative, its absolute right, its sole right, to make judgments of taste in relation to building design. We tutors desperately want the students to appear interested and engaged, but we're not prepared to accept the power relations that are present because we're not prepared to accept the fact that power relations are being served, and ultimately the fact that architecture serves the ruling class in a class-divided society. Misrecognition is a word sociologist Pierre Bourdieu used to describe how a certain type of soft power, which he calls symbolic violence, works to reproduce ideas which serve the material interests of the ruling classes. His definition goes like this: every power to exert symbolic violence, that is, every power which manages to impose meanings and to impose them as legitimate by concealing the power relations which are the basis of its force, adds its own specifically symbolic force to those power relations. The crit as symbolic violence. This is my argument here. Number one, the discussion of work at a crit, because students depend on approval to become qualified and find work, becomes a judgment which can thereby impose meanings. Meanings are imposed whenever students submit to judgment. Number two, it conceals the power relations by insisting on its being merely a discussion, and this misrecognition hides power relations generally, and the fact that aesthetic judgments are delivered by the powerful. Power relations are concealed because to acknowledge them at a crit would invalidate the judgments. The crit and all operation of symbolic violence is an instance of liberal or non-authoritarian power. We're not talking about Vladimir Putin here or Xi Jinping, which works by denying that it exists. Number three, the system of power in capitalist society is class structure, whereby wealth is transferred down the generations using laws and institutions. Aesthetic judgments can, quote, add their own specifically symbolic force to those power relations, but only if they are misrecognized as being independent of those power relations. Finally, the judgments of a crit add their own specifically symbolic force to those power relations by legitimizing a process of judgment without discussion. Students learn to make judgments in certain ways, maybe using reason, but always without discussion. The result is reproduction of both certain judgments of taste and certain ways. Okay. Judgments of taste. Taste is a major form of differentiation between social classes, and the legitimization of the tastes of the ruling class is part of the legitimization of the ruling classes generally. Marx said, quote, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The class that has control of the means of material production has, generally speaking, control of the means of mental production. The culture of the ruling class seeks thereby to become universalized, when in fact it is arbitrary, not deduced from any universal principle, hence the basis of the term good taste. Rethinking the Crit. We did a project called Rethinking the Crit. We've introduced alternative forms of assessment and review to Richview, having worked with people in Bolton Street. TU Dublin. And we've been running them for the last 2 years. Alice has been running them in the second year here in Richview, and they've been going really well. She asked me to say this. They just have been. We'll talk more about that later. I'll just go back to my particular critique here, which is a little bit maybe cynical in some ways, because we had a symposium. So, okay, I'll continue reading. The Crit is an almost perfect example of the institutional exercise of symbolic violence, but not perfect, because the use of force is not completely concealed, which is why we have a project called Rethinking the Crit, looking at alternative forms of assessment and review. But is Rethinking the Crit just a sophisticated attempt to reconcile the power relations in architectural education in order to regain lost hegemony? Students were told to attend the symposium which we had in 2019. So was telling them, you must rethink the Crit in order to complete the course, itself an act of symbolic violence, maybe the ultimate concealment of the use of force to impose meanings and values. So if I, your tutor, say you must question your tutor, then you must question me telling you to question your tutor. And you must question me telling you to question me, telling you to question your tutor, and so on. The only way out of this conundrum is to accept that all education beyond the family is founded upon state authority. And as everyone knows, architecture itself is necessarily implicated in power relations because it is an expensive symbolic good. As Kim Dovey says, the question is not whether architecture constructs identities and stabilizes meanings, but how and in whose interests. This is why I think we need to think of the Crit as a ritual. The idea of ritual brings into view certain practices which have their own logic, but which are not logical as such. Bourdieu said that a ritual is, quote, like a dance. One goes from right to left or from left to right and follows a practical logic, that is, a logic that is intelligible, coherent, but only up to a certain point beyond which it would no longer be practical, and oriented towards practical ends, that is, the actualization of wishes, of desires, and through them of the social structures that have produced these dispositions. A big mistake in considering rituals is to impute reasonableness onto the minds of the actors, what Bourdieu calls, quote, the most serious epistemological mistake in the social sciences is, quote from Bourdieu, to place the models that the scientists must construct to account for practices into the consciousness of agents, to operate as if these constructions were the main determinant, the actual cause of practices. To study the Crit in terms of how well it performs educational tasks is, in my view, to commit just such an epistemological error. This is to ignore the precisely ritualistic aspects of the Crit, which derive from its dual function of reproducing both the dominant culture and the power relations that give rise to it, and at the same time ensuring the misrecognition of the power relations it exerts to that end. In other words, the Crit has nothing to do with education. So, okay, finally, the aesthetic disposition. The cultural reproduced Crits involves that aesthetic disposition which has value for certain groups in history who have achieved freedom from economic necessity. It involves precisely idealistic view of society in which problems are resolved using ideas rather than as a result of struggle between classes or political action. Training students to consider architecture in exclusively aesthetic and not socioeconomic terms is why the Crit is necessarily necessarily ritualistic. This is also why we never have critics from commercial practices where the vast majority of graduates will end up working. A ritual is a socializing practice where values get passed down through the generations and is by nature reproductive and conservative. Participants in a ritual are going through the motions, endlessly repeating forms and ceremonies, the aim of which is to reproduce, stabilize, and reinforce existing social roles and relationships. Ritual players know their respective places and they turn up in order to acknowledge and act out predetermined roles. This isn't to suggest that a ritual is eventful or predictable. For instance, if a bullfight is a ritual, it certainly doesn't lack danger or excitement. The matador is really playing with fire and things very occasionally go wrong for him. But in general, any bullfight is not going to lead to some general triumph of bulls over humans. The danger is real, but is contained within an order of things which is stable. So ritual enacts symbolic struggle between individual agents, but the outcome of the struggle between the classes to which the individual agents belong is always already assured. And the purpose of the ritual is to endlessly prove this, to repeat ad infinitum the victory of one side over the other. The occasional local defeat, such as the death of Matador Barrio in 16, by the way, the first major Matador to die since the 1920s, serves to reinforce this scheme by creating a plausible appearance of chance, the exception that proves the rule. Likewise, the ideological purpose of a bad crit is to create the illusion that what is being judged is work rather than people, and also to hide the fact that the choice of people has already taken place when they were accepted into the course. Now that is a statement I just made, which is clearly controversial and polemical, and would need to be backed up. People could disagree with, I totally accept, and look forward to people arguing against this argument. So my conclusion is the symbolic violence of crits, which takes the form of the arbitrary judgment of taste of the work of students by people empowered by the state to refuse students admission to a profession in front of their peers at a time of life when social integration is particularly important. And all of it conducted in complete denial of these conditions creates a perfect ideological system. And the conclusion is that if we wish to free architecture from its obligations as decorator of power, as bourgeois instrument, we should henceforth cease to misrecognize the power relations at the heart of architectural education. If we want to work for the benefit of all, we must first work for a world where everyone has the leisure to enjoy architecture, or, as Bourdieu says, the experience of the beautiful, which Kant describes, has definite conditions of possibility, material wealth, that are ignored by Kant, and its universal possibility could become real only if those economic and social conditions were universally allocated, i.e. revolution. So anyone to disagree with this, because this is a very reductive, a very grim picture of our education in which we are caught up in forces essentially beyond our control, and which I believe we are, and that we reproduce those forces in our practices on a daily, hourly basis. And we do it by not acknowledging the existence of power relations and practices. Anyone like
Mark? Hi Mark, Stephen here. How are things?
Well, Stephen, you came to my first talk on crits 43 years ago, and again,
it's a ritual.
Well, thank you for remembering. I mean, Mark, just in terms of suggestions and discussions of alternatives, and I'd like to know what Alice is doing in second year, etc. But I mean, one thing we have tried to do is, just have crits effectively with tutors in the background. And I don't know whether that fits within the power dynamic that you're describing, or whether that shifts it so that it can still be a useful discussion. Because a lot of the issues, obviously, in crits are things that are being shared by a number of students. And so it is kind of worth having it as a group discussion, because otherwise you're just having to repeat yourself, or the same discussions having to be repeated again and again. And it is of interest to everybody else to see and talk about people's work, and to kind of see that. So in terms of kind of readjusting it so that you kind of can, I suppose, displace the power problems and still make it useful.
That's Stephen, that's what Patrick Flynn, well, I started with Patrick Flynn like maybe 5 years ago or something, more now. I say we started, he did his master's on this, and then the two of us started working together. We had a symposium, and basically there's a bunch of people around the world writing about this. People like Rachel Sarah, who made the video that we showed at the beginning. And we got them over for a symposium, and we got them over for another symposium beginning of last year, well, the year before last. And Patrick, in the meantime, developed alternative forms of assessment and review, which I worked a bit with him on it. And then Alice took them over here, and they do address these things. And it's only because of my monomania that I want to focus on these sort of general cultural ideas that I'm interested in. But it has to be acknowledged that there are alternative ways, and that, for instance, talking around a table in a group is different from a crit. And we found certain opportunities in online work and student-led, student involvement in organization or the staging of a review. So there are, Stephen, yes, and there are ways, and the results of the research that Patrick and now Alice has been carrying out, insofar as this research is reliable in that it's made up of questionnaires and feedback, has been overwhelmingly positive. And there isn't a loss of what you describe. There isn't a loss of proper discussion and interesting discussion. These experienced architects have something to share. There is something valuable to be talked about. And there are ways of having those discussions while, as you say, displacing or unplugging the structure of the crit.
Yeah, I mean, the students have told us before that some of the part that they enjoy the most is when the critics disagree with each other, when there's kind of a fiery disagreement and it rages on into a kind of a debate. And if you get, you know, two quite contrary, perhaps, sort of critics, it can turn into something interesting in a bit of theatre.
Yeah, I mean, my thesis is that the crit as a ritual is about judgments which don't have debates. It's precisely about that idea of the judgments being delivered. It's, in other words, I said it's about architecture as a field claiming the prerogative to make judgments of taste, which is really all about judgments which are not about discussion. And the crit structure really leads itself to that. And the way to prove that is to look at how it's hierarchically arranged. The ultimate crit is where we get our favorite architect in the world to come and be a guest. And I've actually been here, I'm sure you've been, when I've been asked, today we're going to have Mrs. Y or Mr. X. And then it said, we would be grateful if the local staff would keep their gobs shut for a while because the students want to get the benefit of this great person. So the hierarchy, in other words, the prestige which underpins the judgments is the important thing. And that's the thing that I keep pointing to, is that association between aesthetic judgments and prestige, which is essentially arbitrary and is backed up by clearly the people who get invited as critics are the people who are most successful in published work. And that's the way it should be. And we shouldn't be getting people who are not. But the unfortunate result is that discussion is not. So that's why when tutors disagree. Yes, students love that because it creates the possibility that there is something up, there's some game to be played, that this isn't just a ritual.
I mean, just sorry, one more thing. I mean, in terms of the punctuation of my memory of architectural education, the thing that stands out most obviously are the trips. But the second thing that stands out are the interesting critics that came. And sometimes it was brutal, but it was always memorable, particularly the crits that stood out. And in terms of, I suppose, giving something memorable to students in terms of their journey through 5 years of architecture, having the opportunity to have debates or discussions or even insults from people. And I know this doesn't deal with the power issues, but it is something notable within architectural education that is different to virtually any other type of education.
Yeah.
Could I come in, Mark, just on a...
Yes, you go for it.
Sorry, I'm just on a slightly different note, because I was just thinking about what the ritual reinforces and what it doesn't. And in a way, I'm also referring back to what Stephen was saying. Like, it seems to me that the crits, you could argue, are not really very good instruments for looking at design propositions in any kind of detailed or methodical way. And we were just, like, I was in a seminar earlier, we were just talking about Akil Mo and his kind of deconstruction of the Seagram building in terms of energy use and so on. And a lot of the sort of actual ways in which architecture performs cannot be, I think, demonstrated or critiqued really usefully in the setting of a crit, which tends to dwell on firstly, there's the idea of the author, and secondly, then there's the project of the author, and then thirdly, there's the preoccupations of the critic, and none of them really have, none of them really permit you getting beyond a certain superficial level. And I actually think the memorable ones are when the conversation diverges from the project at hand into a more substantive discussion of something to do with, you know, capital and architecture or decoration or wherever it is. Do you know what I mean? That actually it works when it's stopped doing what it's ostensibly supposed to do. It's a sort of, it's maybe a ritual that at certain points gives you access into some other arena that you'd like to get to more directly and more often, but the only way we know how is to get in through that. I'm just thinking aloud a bit, but it just strikes me that it's not terribly potent, you know, as a as a ritual, actually.
I think its potency can be measured to some extent by its longevity.
Yeah.
Longevity, its persistence in various forms. And this is what makes leads me to that ritualistic aspect. There's so many things about it which ritual is a stabilizing practice in any group. And Bourdieu is very interesting. He doesn't deny the autonomy of his cultural fields. In fact, he says that their ideological effectivity depends on their autonomy. It depends on precisely the firewalls that exist between the different fields. This is why commercial architects couldn't work at a crit, because that would break down a certain necessary wall between the economic and cultural fields. For the cultural field to be ideological, it must be autonomous. But that opens up the possibility of criticality. The very thing you discussed, you referred to, Hugh, is when people arrive and, notwithstanding all of the things we talk about, actually start teasing apart these issues of, let's say, the role of architecture in the reproduction of the relations of production, or in the condition of the city in relation to inequality, for example. These things can get discussed completely independently. Those people who turn up with the crits are not pulling the wool over people's eyes. But the whole thing ultimately becomes ideological, particularly when somebody like me stands up and goes, this entire thing is corrupted by power. That is the most ideological thing, because what I'm trying to do is actually bury even further the power relations. And there's no way out of this other than to acknowledge, and this is what Bourdieu's great contribution is, to acknowledge that all education is founded on authority. And once we acknowledge that, then we can start to work with it. Once we acknowledge that authority. And that's why I'm skeptical about Paulo Freire. I'm not because of his background in fighting for oppressed people, and I couldn't possibly be skeptical in any meaningful way, but I am a little bit about Chomsky because of his, wonderful but ultimately anarchistic ideal. Because what society does he refer to in which, we have these equals entering into discussions? The Occupy movement, maybe, or something, or Athens, 500 BC. So, anyway, now I'm just rambling on. Anyone else?
I am on my year out this year, but last year in third year, I had a full year of Roundtables, which is the alternative to UD or presenting for crits.
I went to one of them. Yeah. In Bolton Street. Yeah.
So I'm a guinea pig to this alternative system. And there's something Stephen said that I'd like to tell him, that we actually had guest tutors come in for our roundtables. So we were getting just an alternative type of engagement from outside tutors, and it was much more enjoyable. Like one of the tutors we had in was Paulo Providencia from Portugal. And after the roundtables, he was going around and people could just pull him over and he'd look at your drawings. And that was probably one of the most beneficial interactions I've had with an architect outside of my tutors. That I don't think I've ever gotten from a crit, or that I ever would get from a crit. That's not to say that I see merits to crits and roundtables. I don't think roundtables could come in and fully replace crits. But there's definitely a lot of merits to them. They definitely improve my production and the way I thought about my work. I felt a lot more equal to my tutors. They all appeared more human as well, which I think is important, because I think sometimes we're maybe not taught to be empathetic or to be empathetic with our work. So having an actual discussion that was fruitful kind of made you think about your projects a bit better, kind of a bit more of an awareness of yourself maybe as well. Now I'm rambling.
Thanks, Kate. And I want to throw in a reference. When you say roundtable, it occurs to me Claude Levi-Strauss' work on early anthropological work. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to, but he describes, for instance, where in certain societies, villages were arranged in circular patterns, and following colonization and resettlement, the same people ended up in villages which were actually orthogonal in their layout. And so there's something just in the shape and that word round in round table. There's something about this. Again, back to ritual and back to practices. They have this other embodied and quite structural, physical dimension.
Mark, just, I mean, I think that's interesting too, because Kate's talking about this thing in some ways of format, I think, or how we relate to people. And I've also been reading, and it's kind of an annoying book called Horizon by Barry Lopez, but he's talking about, in a way, from an anthropological perspective, the thing about, and I think this comes to authority, the thing about who selects the elders, or that sort of sense of, you know, this thing of what, because he's talking about stabilization and so on, and these things that perpetuate, you're not coming at it from a Marxist perspective, but from an anthropological perspective as to how people vest authority in certain people in societies and so on. So I suppose that's an interesting question about, in a sense, are we, or in the kind of crit role, that there's this sort of self-appointed authority without acknowledging the sort of obligations of that authority in a way, which is, again, going back to what you was talking about, because in a way, maybe it does get interesting when we're actually able to teach from authority, or convey something that I know this, or then we may argue about it, or we may talk about it and so on, as opposed to the endless, I suppose, Stephen, you were talking about the bruising opinion, but the culture we have from crits, I do think perpetuates, or something in our architectural education perpetuates certain behaviors, because anyone who's practiced and has been in meetings with multiple disciplines, and if you are dealing with an architect in a different body, you will find they behave very differently to their peer architects than engineers behave towards their peer engineers. It's worth a study. And there's something which is actually entrained in people about that. I see Doug slightly nodding there, I think. I don't know, but I think there is actually a behavior that gets perpetuated in a certain way. Anyway, I'll shut up now. But that's...
I have a reference. I'll just type in a reference before you go on that is the socialization of architectural preference, an article in the field of experimental psychology, environmental psychology from 20 years ago by Margaret Wilson at Liverpool University. There's a little bit of research into of an anthropological, environmental psychological aspect, or certainly sociological. Anyway, sorry, so I cut across somebody who was about to say something.
It was just me, Mark. I was going to say there's two slightly different issues, isn't there, between the format that's chosen and then the characters involved. Like when you take that clip that you had shared amongst the second year staff the other day, it's the characters involved that are problematic there, isn't it?
Yes.
So the format, like if you put the same characters into a roundtable review, there's an equal problem. And equally, if you put, you know, maybe more open-minded people into that crit setup, it could work differently.
Great.
Like, obviously, I've been involved with Mark in second year for the last 2 years. We've kind of been doing this, and a lot of the work is around changing the format, as I would understand it. You know, it breaks down that situation where someone's having to stand in front of their work and present it in that way to a bank of people sitting in chairs in front of them. But beyond that, it doesn't change, in a sense that you still have people who are invited to give their opinion. So, you know, like they're the issues as I would see it. Like the format has changed for us, and there's undoubted benefits. And the roundtable review that we had before the break was really great, but it was a luxury in a sense that we had time and an amount of people that you just would never normally have. You know, like we'd two visiting tutors to talk to 4 students over an afternoon. Is hard to replicate in any other format.
It's a great opportunity on the online learning, we think, going forward, that we can get great benefit from that. Just a point you made, Oran, I think with the great respect that I always have for you, I would say the error I believe you're making is to say that a problem is because so-and-so behaved badly. And, you know, I know that the Marxist critique in its most general form has undergone many challenges in history and continues to do so. But it has always this great advantage that it's attempts to analyze relations in their purely structural, necessary form, rather than the bad apple theory, you know, that something bad happened because a terrible boss exploited the workers in the following way. Marx, whether you agree or disagree with his analysis, sets out to show that whenever somebody owns the means of production and whenever somebody is forced to sell their labor to survive, that is exploitative per se in itself, without anything else happening. And so the analysis, I think the anthropological analysis is useful, and so is the sociological one, because it tries to show us that this structure of the crit has itself certain dynamics implicit in its structure. Doesn't matter who's going.
Then maybe, and I appreciate it's a skit or whatever, but then maybe that video isn't helpful in a sense, because when I watch it, what I see is, you know, one character, and they're playing characters obviously, but one who's clearly just rude, someone else who's disinterested, someone else who's behaving inappropriately towards one of the students. And that distracts from, if there is an issue with the format of that to me distracts from the real discussion then. Yeah, because equally, if those characters are involved in a roundtable review, there's equally an inappropriate comment made towards somebody. There's somebody who's disinterested. There's someone who's clearly just rude and interested only in their own thoughts. And like I have sat in, and I'm going back to pre-COVID times, but like, you know, I've sat in on what you would describe as a traditional crit, let's say, but a quite informal situation where the only difference really is where the student was standing as opposed to sitting with us. But outside of that, the conversation wasn't much difference, I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what's the real shift, because, you know, on one hand, some of the things you're talking about would require, you know, a real change, and some of the things I think that we're involved in, and they have been very good. I'm not being critical, but some of the things we have been involved in the second year, as I said, is a tweaking of format to try and break down that.
You could say that we're, you know, and I'm useless in a way because I'm not that interested in the reformist position. I'm really interested in this analysis, the structural analysis, just the thing I'm really interested in. And at one point, Alice, in some exasperation in a conversation recently said, "Could you ever stop talking about power?" And I went, "No." But I guess what you're talking about is the Owenism of the crit. You know, Robert Owen figured out quite early on that if you want to get a factory where people are actually more productive, well, then make them happier, give them housing, give them schools, give them sports facilities. And that's the basis of social democracy, of reformism, of not challenging the basic system, but making it work better. And by making people happier, and therefore they'll be more productive, and that's maybe fine. But I'm just interested in this structure. And I'm thinking that the real challenge from Bourdieu is to acknowledge all teaching is founded on authority. And that's backed up by violence, because it's ultimately backed up by the state in its role regulating the economy.
It would be interesting, because I can see, I don't know how many people here are students, so I can certainly see some I recognize. Like, it'd be interesting to hear from the students their view on hearing feedback from, you know, the so-called expertise, you know, like a student's preference for hearing feedback from their own classmates versus from tutors or visiting critics. If there's anybody there that wants to give us a view on that, because that's some of what you're talking about, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, certainly, that's part of it. Anyone like to talk about experiences like Kate shared with us? Anyone else who'd like to share about experiences, about crits or about alternatives?
I would say that the students in general probably would care a lot more about the feedback from their peers, or opinions from their peers, than they would for from crits at the end of the day, because I don't know, we've all had days where there was reviews and there was kind of, like Oren would be talking about, there was just a bad apple or something that day, and everyone got a hard time. So I don't know, I think that makes crits less valuable for us in a way, so sometimes.
But have you had useful crits, Owen? I mean, can you say that there's been crits that weren't like that?
Yeah, but I've never really thought that it was useful because it was crit. Like, it could have been just as useful, the same feedback at a desk review, I guess.
I think as well, in a lot of senses, obviously a crit is at the end of a project, so it's almost a little bit too late to hear a lot of this stuff. And it's kind of, it just leaves you full of doubts afterwards. And to me, it knocks my confidence a lot of the time in my project. And it kind of, you sort of almost, you wish you'd listened, you'd heard that, or someone had told you that, or even as a visiting critic, you just explored that 6 weeks previously. Yeah. So it's almost too little too late in a way. But like saying that, like an interim review is always more useful than a final critique or final crit. Yeah.
I mean, the model of critique is misplaced. Can you imagine if critics turned up at the opening night of a play, or wrote about a film that's just been produced, or a critic reviewing a book that's just been released? No one ever pretends that the purpose of that is to get the author to go and redo the thing in order to make it conform to the views of the critic. So there's a real confusion here in terms of education and critique. And the other one I mentioned in my talk was that this is somehow or other replicates client-architects relationships. No, it doesn't. Maybe to the extent that you might present to the city council, and that might be where there's a number of different stakeholders, and you would need to be confident and so on. But they are stakeholders, and your client is always on an equal footing with you. Now, people say, oh no, because we are in a subordinate relationship to the moneyed interests in society. Yes, but they need us. The capitalist class needs architecture for specific symbolic reasons and other reasons. So we are very much integrated into the economy, and we are very much necessary. So the models at which Crit is meant to allude to, they just don't stand up. And architects would never allow their work to be critted in this free-for-all manner. Architects aren't famous or notorious for organizing how their work is received, publishing work in particular ways, in particular frameworks. And I would be doing that too. If I was into that, I would be making sure that I would not be putting it out there. I was at it's a little anecdote. I was in Paris one day. Sarah Kremen, who you know now, was working for Herzog and Demeron at the time, and they opened a block of flats in Paris, and I was living there. So I went along. They were giving a talk outside this apartment building about their new design, Herzog and Demeron. This is 15, 20 years ago. And some woman walked by, and she started into this rant, a local woman who lived next door. Wow, what an ugly, it was mosh, it was this, it was dengue, everything she could think of was dragged out. And the poor unfortunate person from Basel tried to continue giving this talk to all us architects. And it was a fantastic clash of universes. And we're all familiar with that. This is the story of modernism almost, is the story of that disconnect between how we frame our work and how the punters do.
Hi.
Oh, Doug.
Could I add, you brought up the question of violence there again. And symbolic
violence, yeah.
And you mentioned it without the symbolic bit. And I know the symbolic violence, that's a term that Bourdieu used, and it's, from the 70s. I just question whether such a thing exists. like the symbolic bit, surely it's just violence, and he, you know, refers to it as a non-physical violence, but surely all violence is physical, whether it's words that cause trauma, you know, it's just physical. Whether it's, you know, a stick or whether it's a word, it still has a physical effect on, you know, people. And we know a bit more about trauma and in the last 50 years. So I guess my question is, well, that's one question, I suppose, is that still useful to use the word symbolic? Why not just call it violence? And then I'm interested about, you know, the idea of the ritual, following on from that, about how the ritual could still be useful. Like eventually the sword fighting dances, they have to replace the swords with, you know, flexi, you know, like the martial arts dance where they replace them with flexible swords, you know, or Mars dancing replaces the rapper swords with little harmless sticks. Is there a way that you could still have the ritual but just acknowledge that the violence probably isn't a good thing, but you could replace it with something else that isn't actually violent, you know, continue the dance but not have the actual violence or even the threat of violence, you know, which people have pointed out is also very proud, like, you know, that even if violence isn't there, the threat of it has still got
your second part of your question, yes, and that's, I guess, the Rethinking the Crit project and all of those reformist, Owenist, I call them, you know, the reformist approach. The answer to your second question is yes, we can work to reform and to keep the good bits, not throw the water out with the baby. Or is it the other way around? No, the symbolic violence is a very important term, Doug. We have to hold on to it, I'm afraid. I'm very sorry, but it has to stay. And the reason is, this is Bourdieu's contribution. One of the main critiques of Marxist analysis of society is what's called determinism or economism, is that people have no choice. People are caught up, cogs in the machine, and they're driven relentlessly by forces, structural forces. And it's a valid critique of classical Marxism. It's denial of agency, that it treats people as though they have no independence. Bourdieu's contribution, one of the people whose contribution in late Marxism is to recover agency by means of this idea of symbolic violence. Because unlike real violence, which includes economic threats, real violence does, symbolic violence allows the victim, the person who's subject to it, some agency, some choice. What distinguishes symbolic violence is not whether it's physical or not, but whether there's a choice, whether the person has some say in the matter. So somebody who's subject to a process of symbolic violence has a choice about it, whereas somebody who is subject to an economic threat doesn't. Even if there's no immediate threat of violence, they have no choice but to go along with what's being proposed. By the way, the context of this must be seen in the description of ideology generally. Remember, the ideas of the ruling class in every epoch are the ruling ideas. No one can be forced to think something. So symbolic violence works in that area of control, whereby people end up practicing certain things. We live in a society where most people don't believe that it's run in the interests of the majority. And yet they continue to go to work every day. They continue to vote the same people in. They continue to go through these practices. How do we explain that disconnect between what people believe and how they act, other than by using a term like symbolic violence, where they're compelled and yet they chose to be compelled? This is, again, Bourdieu's terms are habitus and field. Habitus is that collection of driving and motivating internal values, ideas, decisions, which are inculcated by practice, by education.
Yeah, I can see how it kind of the use of the language itself can maybe turn people onto an idea, but it just feels like it's more, it's suggested it's to call it not physical violence, just, you know, it seems to be not true.
No, because it's economic. I mean, economic violence is real violence. And so is the threat of physical harm. That's all real violence. Symbolic violence is when you have a choice about it, and it's the imposition of meanings, which conceals. And the key thing there is it also adds its own, symbolic violence adds its own symbolic force to those power relations which are served.
Which, does it mean that symbolic violence can still be physical violence?
Oh yes, I mean,
okay.
it's unlikely to be, because you can't hit somebody and force them to believe in something. So it's really never going to be physical. It's soft power.
Yeah, but my take on this, it's physical if it has physical effects, and whether the physical or sound waves, like physical, impacts on people.
Maybe. It's a good point. It's a point that could be argued out very usefully. So one of the great things is that we started talking about this, and fairly limited, but we're still talking about it, which means it's you're talking about our own practice. Once you're talking about your own practice, you begin to open up the possibility of development and incorporation. I think architecture is faced with a serious crisis of how it lives in such an unequal world. How does it continue to be a plausible, autonomous field when it can't do anything to contribute to the problem of inequality? And so that means this kind of discussion is hopefully conducive to figuring out ways in which architecture. In the current book club, we've been having a number of readings where we were looking at these problems, looking at how could architects stop just being decorators of power. My thesis is that they need to look at their practices in the school. And Doug, symbolic violence, because the students are the ones who are called upon to take action here, actually not us. And I used to end these talks when I used to give them the past with the clip from the old Ian Carmichael, Terry Thomas film, School for Scoundrels, where Stephen Potter is running this one-upmanship school in Yeovil. And the whole idea is that by learning how to play various tricks, you could get one up on other people. And at the end of the film, the good guy ends up getting the girl because Terry Thomas is exposed as having been a dirty rotter who just used these tricks to get ahead. So this is all about school for scoundrels. Once we go along with these practices uncritically, we're taking part in the same structures of power that lead to the inequality that is making the world very dangerous at the moment. I mean, always was, nothing new there, but we see again and again in different areas these emerging threats.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's kind of ironic how a lot of students are afraid to speak up because of the system that we exist in, even though we're the ones that are expected to change it, So I just think it's kind of funny.
Well, in my talk, I said, you must rethink the crit. That's the ultimate form of symbolic violence. Because I'm going, you must question your tutor. Yeah. Therefore, you must question me, telling you to question your tutor, and so on. And Bourdieu deals with this really well. He talks about the man who tells you he's lying in Plato, Epimenides. So you're crucified either way. Either you believe he's lying, in which case you can't believe what he's saying, or you don't believe him, in which case he's telling the truth, but he's telling you he's lying. So there's no way out of this. The only way out of it is to acknowledge authority. Alice, continue.
Yeah, that's all I want to say, really. But I definitely feel like I'm afraid to speak up all the time because of being shot down because of the power, that.
I'd like to talk to you later, Alice, about what you just said. I'm not happy. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that, that is a perfect example of the power relations and that, from, say, first year of college, I think a lot of students suffer trauma from being shot down. If you go into a crit with any bit of confidence, I don't think it's often not well received and they want to tear you down sometimes. I'm not saying that that's the case for everyone, but I'm not saying that every tutor does that, but I've experienced that in the past and it's kind of traumatizing, traumatizing experience. Alice, and it's stayed with me since first year. So
if a friend of mine says this is something I've done, I get really traumatized. I'm really upset, just because I want to be praised.
Yeah.
But my friend doesn't have the power to decide whether I'm going to be able to earn my living or not.
Yeah.
It makes it 10 times worse. Of course you're going to be traumatized because whether you like it or not, you're subject to this power in a very real way.
Yeah.
But added to it is your own, as a human, desire to be nurtured and appreciated and to be given positive feedback. I think the critics at a crit are under huge pressure. And I don't think it's conducive to them behaving in a nurturing way, in a supportive way, because of the pressure they're under.
Yeah.
Traumatized is the word, first time it's been used. I'm glad you've shared that, because that, to me, seems to be an experience that most people have.
Yeah, I would say that most students do. Owen, maybe you can relate, I don't know. But
I do have been traumatized. Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. It's kind of interesting because it seems to me, well, from what the idea I have is that students in crits to perform well are expected to be kind of have to be submissive, even if they've really, really good work to show and could present it really confidently. Whereas in the commercial world, architects have to be the opposite. They have to be quite kind of bold and very confident and, you know, a bit more dismissive of their clients' critiques than, or well, not clients, but.
Well, I tried to make the point in my analysis that this is all about judgments without discussion, that claiming that right to go, this is cool, this isn't. Now, I may give you reasons, or I may have awards that gives authority to this, or I may be a charismatic person, but really it is just about that judgment.
Yeah, and often there's not enough time to even really properly assess the work in the like 15 minutes that you might get for a review, and the amount of time and effort that goes into actually preparing for a review is ridiculous, and students under so much pressure. And then in that video at the start, it also highlights that, in that, like, oh, lunchtime is coming up now, so we're going to rush through this student. You know, that's a perfect example, I think, of
Hugh made the point earlier that it's a really bad way of actually talking about work, because it's just so little time, particularly when the guest comes. They've only just seen this project for the first time. How can they really understand it? And yeah, it's a terrible way of critiquing work. It's a ritual, guys. It's got a ritual function. It's not about education. It's about reproducing certain behaviors and certain practices. I suggest it's about the practice of passing aesthetic judgments of taste, if you like, in a way that's authoritative, which is what architecture as a field claims as its prerogative. That's my thesis. It's the only explanation for it. It's such a useless method. What Rethinking the Crit has proved is that there's so many other ways of actually educating people, of actually having work reviewed.